introduction herself. In fact, Lee, if you want to do that, and then I'll kick it off with the first question.
Yeah. So basically, I'd like to make an intro of, basically this MIT Sensei book club, and then how we have chosen this book. So basically, when we all went lockdown, then we thought of, activities that we should do to actually help bring the MIT community together. And then we thought, why, since, the current events, with the environment and stuff, basically spurs lots of conversations. So we decided, okay, let's do a book club, basically mainly on sociology, like nonfiction books. And so we started with the first one, which is Michelle Obama's Becoming. And then we basically, had, I think, 30 plus attendance, from actually surprisingly from all over the world. And then usually, we would only have attendance from the Bay Area. So that was really a surprise. We're really, happy about that. And so the first one went really well. And so on the second book, and then, considering all the events and then, well, the leadership or the lack of leadership, so we decided, okay, why don't we read a book that is related to leadership? And then when I was, so I'm a venture capitalist. So when I was in my previous company called Best Venture Partners, so my colleagues, we have been basically talking about this book called Team of Teams by, Stan, he really, General McChrystal. Yeah. So basically, we highly recommended that book. So basically, I recommended that, why don't we read this book? And then it turned out that everyone, basically, within the organizational team, then everyone likes it. Yeah. So that's how we decided, on the book. Yeah. And then Suja, basically, is our president for the club, basically suggested that, oh, why, I can actually invite Stan, to actually, be at our book club. And then that basically, is such a highlight. So we feel really grateful. Thank you, Stan. So yeah, so with this, let's kick it off.
Yeah. Now, as for audience questions, I'm putting a link to an app called Slido in the chat that everyone should be able to see. So participants are all muted, but please feel free to use the Slido link. And then as we get to audience Q&A, we will curate and ask questions from there. So now, General, it's all right if I call you Stan then. Okay, so Stan, I thought we'd start with really the most general question. Now, this being MIT, very likely everyone has read the book, engaged with the book, is fairly familiar, but I did still want to ask you to start with sort of the very, probably most basic question of how constructing a team of teams, how is that different and similar to constructing a team? Which I think the sort of small teams you described are something everyone's familiar with, and the large teams are something that we all probably aspire to in our corporate environments.
Yeah, the basic difference, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate you all taking the time, let me be a part of it. All of us have been a part of some kind of small team, whether it's church or a sports team or family. You can finish each other's sentences, you know how you're going to react. And then when it gets beyond a certain size, it just doesn't work anymore because there's just too much scale. You don't know everybody, and that real familiarity and the trust and the shared understanding of what's happening typically runs weak. Then you talk about scaling and you break into smaller teams like we organize, and you have in a military unit, it's subordinate units. In a company, it might be human resources, it might be finance, marketing, that sort of thing. And each of those teams develops its own processes and culture over time. They'll typically get t-shirts that say we're HR, we're finance. And that's good because it builds cohesion. But the challenge is, how do you get those teams to work together? Now, in traditional industrial age hierarchy, Frederick Winslow Taylor models, what you do is you create a very well-constructed organization in which each organization does its part of the job. And they call it MISI, or mutually exclusive, collectively exhausted. So the entire mission gets done. And that works perfectly on paper. And if you have an unchanging environment, pretty static environment with the same output, that can even work in practice, almost like a complicated factory would. But once things start changing rapidly and the environment gets complex, it doesn't. So now the teams have got to be meshed together, much like individuals in a small group. Now you've got dynamics that are hard. And I'm not gonna, you can read Team of Teams 10 times and get it all. This is still hard to do.
And I guess thinking about the sort of historical context, moving from Winslow Taylor to modern day, obviously communication has changed a lot and management philosophy has changed a lot. Something that some friends and I were wondering is sort of, well, we feel today like communication is instantaneous. And so you should be able to have a model where someone centralized can make decisions and push them out, because that should happen extremely quickly. But in the historical context, surely that wasn't true, because you can't picture someone in the Civil War writing a letter to Lincoln sort of asking exactly what to do. So I guess my question is, are we returning to an older model where people on the edges have to make decisions because of communication? Or is there something fundamentally different about the world we're in now?
Yeah, there's something fundamentally different, but I'll bore people, walk a few through a little bit of history here. I'll use military, but it applies to industrial as well. There was a period of time when everybody in an army was on a battlefield together. You literally could see left and right. The Battle of Waterloo, essentially all the combatants were within eyesight during the actual battle itself. Wellington could give orders that way by what he saw and whatnot. As things got bigger, suddenly you couldn't. And so you had to give people broad guidance and let them use their best judgment, because you physically couldn't be there in time and space to micromanage them. And that was, I mean, it had its limitations, but it also had some pretty positive things as you give people broad instructions. Then we started to get to like the First World War, and suddenly you have mass armies and you're trying to coordinate things that are more complicated. You're trying to do huge offensive using artillery with precise timing. And these weren't stupid people doing it. They were trying to work this mechanical beast, but they were limited by communications because radios were almost non-existent, so they used wire. So they wired back to higher headquarters, so the information would go to a higher headquarters, which would necessarily then try to manage it like a marionette puppet or something. And of course, it suffered every time, because pretty quickly events on the ground up close to the enemy got different from what the plan had been, and it couldn't respond fast enough, and so it would have big problems. You push forward and you got to modern day warfare. When I commanded in Iraq, I had a counter-terrorist force that was operating across 27 countries simultaneously. And in our different command centers, our situational awareness rooms, there'd be 10 or 12 big flat panel TVs, and I could watch every operation as it was being conducted. I could watch it from Predator, unmanned aerial vehicle, drone, with high definition TV. It was like you were 10,000 feet above them. You could see them like they were right in your backyard. And I could listen to their radio communications if I wanted to. And I could talk if I had wanted to, but I never did. And it gave you the illusion that you know what's going on. It gives you this deceptive idea that I can see everything. I can actually see it better than they can, and therefore I ought to tell them what to do. But you learn pretty quickly you don't know what's going on. You're not on the ground. You don't feel it. You don't hear the crack of the bullet. You don't know the temperature. You don't know how tired people are. And so the temptation to micromanage with technology is huge. If every boss carries a cell phone and every subordinate can call for approval on every decision, there is a temptation to think that they must do that whether they want to or not. And so bosses get used to feeling because they're always available now. The problem is, with a fast-moving environment, that's never effective, because by the time you get the question up and the answer back down, as Heraclitus said, you never step in the same river twice. That's even more true now. And so what the instructions you give them, even they were brilliant the moment they left your mouth of your computer, they're wrong when they get to the point of action. And so this temptation to use digital media to micromanage is one that is pretty destructive on organizations. And yet there's a certain amount of pressure to try to do that.
So it sounds like you're saying that communication might be the problem. Is that fair? It's too fast?
Well, it's simultaneously the problem and the solution. It is the problem because it is what makes things faster. It's what allows things to go so much faster and get so much more complex. It is part of the solution. And of course, in our case, against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, because they had extraordinary communications too. They could do things that no foe had ever done before. And so it is what makes it harder, but it's also part of your solution, because used properly, what you can do is use it to create what we call shared consciousness, a common contextual understanding of the situation and what you're trying to do. Not specific instructions on what to do, but give everybody an understanding that used to be limited only to the headquarters and the generals or the C-suite and the CEO. Suddenly you can push that down to people at much lower levels. Now that's a little frightening, because we push it down to people with less experience, less rank, whatever, and we say, they might make decisions. That's right. In today's world, they have to. And so what you've got to do is push it down to them, but give them the context that enables them to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really difficult. I think a lot of companies, I've thought this is in Silicon Valley, maybe it's everywhere, will have sort of everyone in programming, let's say, and all generalizations are too wrong, are overdone, but many people in these programming companies are very detail oriented and really do want to know everything that's going on. And maybe even more are used to small teams, having worked in like 5-person, 10-person startups where you can know everything's going on. And so you've got this constant tension in a larger company between everyone trying to understand everything everyone else is doing, which would take all of their time to understand the details, or focusing on what they're specifically supposed to do, but then at the expense of feeling like they understand the vision of the company. And so reading through this, I was wondering, can upper management explain the vision clearly enough that people sort of have that satisfaction that they understand how what they're doing fits into the goal, how what their colleagues are doing fits into the goal? Or do we still sort of need to struggle to tell people, look, each individual contributor needs to be able to let go in a way and just realize they're not going to understand what their colleagues are doing. And I do think there's a tension there.
Invariably, there's a tension there, because there's so much complexity and so much information now. We used to say in Jsoc, we want everybody to know everything all the time. And of course, that's ridiculous. You can't. And if you try to know everything, you drown in it. But what you can do is sort of marinate in the information. The way we operated was we operated not in individual offices in these command centers, we call them situational awareness rooms, where the information's around you all the time, even while you're doing just your part of it. And the idea is you're not supposed to master every detail, but you're supposed to have an appreciation for what is happening, so that as the overall situation's changing, those things for which you're responsible, you start to get a sense for where the interdependencies are. What are the things that are going to affect you, which are going to change the situation? It's comfortable to be in an environment where you only have one input of information. In the old days, an inbox. You could kind of control that. It's not hard to sort of digest that. Now we're asking people to take all kinds of information around them, maintain this sense that almost like the sea state for a sailing ship. You've got to have a sense of what the wind is, what the sea state is, where the currents are, what's the depth, all the different things which are changing by the instant. And you've got to be able to adjust what you do. Part of it is intuition, part of it is different parts of the team doing that. But the only thing I've seen that works is to try to push this information across the team, keep up a pretty constant conversation, some of it in video teleconferences, some of it by chat rooms and whatnot, so that everybody has a sense of where we are now, so that what they do isn't right for what was and not for what is.
Maybe regarding interdependencies, you can let people know sort of which colleagues they really do need to have that understanding for, and then understand the higher level vision for everyone else.
You have to try to do that, but the organization has to do that by itself as well. You know, if you require some person at the top to say, these are the interdependencies, they won't get them right. But if you push this information, what I found is organically, the organization starts to understand that. Now, across our command, we did it every single day for the 5 years I commanded, and they kept doing it after I left. And you say, wow, that's crazy. But it was the most efficient thing we did because we got everybody synced every day. And we did it for 90 minutes. And for the next 22 and a half hours, they had an understanding, plus they had connections to everybody else, so they could constantly update it as required. They had a sense of what they didn't know but might need to know.
Yeah, that's very.
I want to add a point.
Thank you.
I feel like, different organizations, are quite different. For example, software engineering teams, and then, it's completely operates completely different, from like a battlefield. And then I think, in my industry, like in VC, I actually see, this dynamic actually plays out like perfectly. Sometimes, let's say, if a junior person, doesn't, let's say, if the junior person couldn't make decision, immediately surface a deal, to the top management to make decision. And then by the time, you basically, like gets to the management, and, gets to the partner, like the top partner, and then, the deal is already gone. And so, in a very fast moving environment, I can see this concept that plays out like perfectly.
Right. There are situations where people go in room and they work a single product or a project from beginning to end, and this isn't nearly as important. But if the requirements for the project are changing constantly and other conditions are, then they have to have some level of this, or even that won't work.
No, totally.
I thought that the section on leading like a gardener, I think that's a very powerful image, sort of combining leadership and mentorship, which are separate but very related. I would like to hear more examples, perhaps that aren't in the book, of points in your history, stories that you've heard that really sort of illustrate really successfully applying those principles.
Yeah, it's I mentioned in the book, but I can hammer it a little harder here. I grew up in a military environment. I was born in an Army hospital, son of an Army officer, went to West Point at age 17, was in the conventional Army, and it is designed to be efficient. It's designed to take young people with no knowledge of the military to come in and get them not to kill themselves and to hopefully defeat the enemy. And so it is bureaucratic. And if you look up innovation in the dictionary, you don't see a picture of the United States Army there. The Army innovates when it has to on the battlefield because people adapt. It doesn't do very well in any other environment. And that's probably to be expected. I was a product of that, and you could succeed in that system being very good at what you did in terms of control, command and control, or micromanaging, as we'd call it in the civilian world. And I could control up to about a company, 150 people, and I could almost tell everybody what to do. Once I got there, though, and I shifted to another kind of company where I had much more competent non-commissioned officer sergeants, then suddenly they wouldn't put up with it, was one, and they pushed back on me. And number two, I found that the more control I let go, the more I pushed down, the more we could do, the more flexible it would be, the more I could focus on things where my value add was higher. And this sounds kind of basic, but then when we got up to, when I got up to being a general officer and I was commanding Joint Special Operations Command, there was this idea that I would take over this organization that had been purpose-built for very specialized operations. And it's important to know the pedigree of Jsoc. It was formed after the failure of the Iran rescue mission in the spring of 1980. And what had happened was very competent, confident, courageous people were put together to do this very complicated operation to go to downtown Tehran and rescue American citizens. And the thing fell apart. It was a model of complexity, almost had to be because of the situation. And they just couldn't make the pieces fit together and work right. But as a result of that, they formed this standing joint task force to do counterterrorism. Now, several things came out of that. One was this extraordinary collection of talent. The military had never done this before. Every person was specially selected, went through these complex selection and assessment programs, got unlimited resources from when the organization was founded. And it had a history of success in the early years from 1981 to 2003. And I was in the command, but in 2003, I became the commander. The other less understood part of its DNA, however, was that it was conservative by nature. Not politically conservative, but it was conservative towards failure, because the failure of the Iran rescue mission carried with it the lesson: we will never fail the nation again on that kind of operation. And when I say conservative, what it meant was they wanted to mitigate risk to zero, not risk personally, physically. It wasn't a question of courage. It was a question of wanting to have perfect intelligence, perfect plan, everything you need, rehearse it relentlessly before you execute it, because nobody wanted to look the president or the nation in the eye and say, we didn't get it done. Now, the downside of that is you can't operate very fast like that. You can't take much risk like that. And there's an organization that's always waiting to get everything just ready and then do it. And as you mentioned earlier, the deal's gone, or the risk has come and gotten you. So that organization is what I took over in 2003. And suddenly we had this new complex task where that model wouldn't work. You couldn't constantly be looking, we're going to go get Osama bin Laden or Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, because you just couldn't get at them. You had to deal with the problem more tactically, which meant that the organization had to be faster, more decentralized, constantly adapting and whatnot. What that meant is my leadership had to be very different, because when I took command of the organization, I personally approved every operation we did. And that had been tradition in the organization because they're important and that's what you do. But we were only doing one a week. And to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we eventually got up to 300 a month, or 10 every night. And if you try to centrally control that, you'll never keep up with the need. So we had to push that down. Now, what that did for me first was create great angst, because I'm pushing things down to people who are taking part of my responsibility, approving things. I am given things for which I'm ultimately responsible to more junior people to make decisions. And I am, of course, retaining responsibility for that. And so the concern on my part was echoed at different levels in the chain of command. People just, that was not our normal way of operating. So what I learned was we had to create a different model. And this is where the Gardner came up. My role went from making decisions. It went from being the head operator to being a person who essentially orchestrated an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, the organization operated. And as long as I did that right, and this is the farmer analogy, if I create the garden, if I ensured that the right things are planted, the right water, it's protected, all those things that allow a garden to operate, and I monitor it constantly, I'm keeping that ecosystem working, then it could operate. And that's exactly as we did that. As I experimented more with it, we did it, turned out to be right. About 2.5 years into command, I used to tell people that what I do is I do CPR on this unit every day. I put the heel of my hand on its chest and I press and I force blood and oxygen through the organization, make it operate. And then for the next 22.5 hours, it does. And then the next day I do it again. Now, had I not done that, I think it wouldn't have kept operating, because military, a lot of things about the culture and whatnot. But at the same time, the best thing I could do was that, and not get too mired in the details of the specific operations, because they ultimately knew better how to do their job than I did. And it wasn't helpful for me to step down and pretend that I knew specifics of each operation and I should mess with them.
I have a follow-on questions, from here. So actually the question is also related to, like Andy asked in the question section. So when, when you plant a garden, let's say, like everything is growing, okay, nice. But what if, like today, let's say, you need grains, and then, you plant like wheat, and then tomorrow you actually need vegetable, and then, your basically your goals just changed. And then how do you actually modify this organization and then quickly adapt?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing is, a lot of organizations, and I've come to have this strong opinion, a lot of organizations restructure or reorganize because they think they should. And that's sort of a symbol or a gesture of activity. But I think it's often self-deceptive. You change parking places and duty titles, and the organization operates the same way. And in the military, if you try to reorganize, you start the paperwork and your grandkids execute it. So there's just no point. What I did with Jsoc is I didn't reorganize anything. We did a bunch of things provisionally. We created new units provisionally. We did these things. And Jsoc, as I mentioned, was a conservative group of people in terms of change. And I had a bunch of strong-willed people. These are very, this is not young soldiers. This is 35 to 50-year-old hard-bitten commandos. Everybody's got an opinion. They're all smarter than the commanding general. And so you get pushback on things if you rush in and say, let's do this. So what I did was, because I didn't know the right answer, I didn't try to come up with the right answer and say, okay, everybody, here's my clever plan. I got in front of the organization and I said, we are losing, and we were in early 2004. Everybody knows we're losing. So here's the deal. The only course of action we have data on is that course of action, the status quo, and it's not working. So we are not going to continue that course of action. Now, what are we going to do? And they all kind of waiting to see. And I gave the big hand wave. And I go, we're going to do whatever works to win. Now, who can be against that? If I had given them a specific plan, the naysayers would have poked holes in it. They probably would have been right. Instead, even the biggest naysayers can't be against whatever it takes to win. And I said, we are going to iterate our way to figuring that out. And you, or we as a group, are going to do that. Everything we do that works, we'll do more of. Everything that we do that doesn't work, we'll stop. And that's my promise to you. My directive to you, though, is push, 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 fast, fast, fast. So we became speed obsessed because we knew we had to change faster, we had to operate faster to compete with and ultimately defeat the enemy. And so what it created was a dynamic where the organization felt like it owned what the structure would be. I mean, there were times it got ahead of me. I went a couple places one time and visited this special intelligence organization, and I said, boy, that is really impressive. And we were walking out of the room and the guy goes, they work for you. You know that, right? They're part of us. I had no clue. But that was a good sign.
Yeah.
Because they weren't waiting to, put a big decision brief. They're just doing it.
I have to say that kind of organizational change is really amazing. I think the Army may be an example of a sort of huge organization, but most large organizations, right? They have that conservative attitude, that aversion to failure, that bias toward inaction when inaction is acceptable at all. And so I wanted to ask if you have anything sort of specific to say, thinking about networks of people or anything else, about specific conversations to have. Sort of how do you get an organization that big, that conservative, with that much of a history to change at all?
Yeah.
There's things that are culturally deeply embedded. So anything
Yeah.
you say about how to enact change?
Yeah, I'd start with this, is understand why they don't change. They don't change because in our case, we were the best counter-terrorist force in the world. We were akin to a Super Bowl winning football team. And now we're going to tell them, okay, next year we're going to play basketball. And that's terrifying because their credibility, their expertise is all now a question mark. There's the fear of failure. I mentioned Jsoc's history. Nobody wants to fail in a mission. And so people want to get everything perfect. And I'm saying you're going to do a lot and you are going to fail, and that's okay. Then there's the idea that people are also incentivized for their organization, for themselves. And so I had this team of teams. I had Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Rangers, but also we had in our task force, the CIA, Department of State, FBI, Department of Treasury, all in there. And every organization not only had its own culture and language, it had its own incentives. CIA wanted to win the war on terror alone. Jsoc wanted to win it. Department of State wanted to negotiate, So everybody comes in with this desire to do it and get credit for it. And so they're pulling in slightly different directions, even though they're not bad people. I mean, it's not like they're evil. It's like they see the world differently. It's the blind men and the elephant. They're all seeing different parts of the elephant, and they're all doing what they think is required based upon what they saw. So the most important thing we could do up first is give everybody a common picture. Tell everybody, okay, this is the situation. And this gets to that every day we did this video teleconference in which we had 7,500 people every day. I only ordered 400 to be there. 7,100 came because that was where you got all the best information. And so they would come. So every day what we focused on was saying, this is the situation right now. This is what we're trying to do in general. It wasn't giving people a lot of orders. It was painting that picture. This is the scoreboard. Now, I don't care about your batting average or your personal stats. I'm not going to give you any credit for those. I'm only going to give everybody credit if we win. It took quite a while to get all the organizations in agreement that, okay, this is what we're trying to do. I mean, I don't want to make this sound easy. I commanded for 5 years, and I think for 18 months, I was punching walls. I was so frustrated that nobody would kind of move, a few early adopters, but it was recalcitrance. And I think it was 3 years before we were past a point of irreversible. Nobody was going to go back. Now this was the way we were. But that was 3 years of fighting every night. We were in combat this whole time, and we fought every single night. So, a lot of repetitions, a lot of learning. So as we did this, the change management was to give everybody that common picture. Then as you're asking people to do things like accept risk in operations, you can say, I want you to accept risk, but they want to see how you react to failure. And so we would do operations, and we were about 70% successful, to be honest, which meant we captured or killed the leader we were after that particular operation, which is high. But it means that 30% of the time you fail. And if you're doing 300 raids every month, you are failing 90 times a month. And some of those failures are pretty spectacular. I mean, really ugly. And so they're briefing these operations the next day in front of 7,500 people virtually. And they've got to come up and say, we did this yesterday and we completely screwed it up. It takes a lot of cultural adjustment for me not to react negatively, to not show my personal frustration or anger or anything like that. Because as soon as I do, I'm not worried about how the people who did the operation are going to do. I'm worried about everybody else who now isn't going to do an operation because they're afraid of being the person tomorrow. And that was a long learned thing to get people to the point where they could understand we're looking for cumulative effect. We're not keeping track of failures. We're track of cumulative successes, which is the better measure. Let me stop there because I'm kind of giving a lot on the change management there.
No, yeah, that's exactly what I was asking. Go ahead, Rachel.
I would love to pull the thread on that a little bit more, because I think that really does hit at something that we hear a lot right now about, fail fast and fail forward. But you have to make sure that the leadership, and at the leadership level, they really are embracing that failure and enabling it in a way that it is not looked at negatively. Because even though an organization can be comfortable failing, you have to make sure that the individuals are the ones comfortable also owning that failure. And I completely agree with you. A 70% success rate is great. And that to me is about the right amount of risk, because higher than that, maybe you're not taking enough risk. So how do you really project that from the highest level, that failure is an option and it's okay to happen occasionally?
Yeah, Rich, that's a great point. For us, there were the individual, the commanders, the people who made decisions on whether to do operations didn't want to run failures, so you had to deal with changing their mindset. The commandos were not really a problem. They were, kind of happy to do it. But then the various levels of the chain of command all went through that. There was the requirement to communicate to people that it's what they learned, and if they failed, and even if they failed because they screwed it up, you have to be able to say, okay, what did we learn? What are we doing tomorrow? And I learned I had to communicate in front of all these people that kind of assurance. So if you did an operation and you screwed it up and you're briefing the next day and you say, sir, we did it all wrong. And I go, okay, and go to the next person. Everybody thinks you're now in the penalty box. Instead, what I've got to do, I say, okay, what did we learn? And then I say, what are you going to do tonight? And that's signaling that, okay, I got confidence in you, get back out there. Now, if I start to lose confidence over time, I deal with you offline separately. I don't, do a big personal thing. But it becomes extraordinarily important to give this overall sense of what the failures got us. We went to look for somebody in one place and the intel was wrong. You got to say, okay, well, we learned something. They're not there, so we won't go there again. That kind of thing. Sometimes you have to really, pull for the positive in a failure, but it's really important, because this idea of failure, it really, inside the United States military, in my career, you couldn't fail anything for most of my career. And what that meant was, if you had a personal failure, if you got a DUI, if you did something in your life, your career's done. And there was no redemption from someone who commands something and it doesn't do well. Look at Navy guys who run their ship aground or something like that, they're done. And you say, well, that's good because we have high standards. The problem is you don't have anybody with scar tissue. And you need some people with scar tissue because, one, they show everybody else it's okay to take risks. And two, you learn from that. I made some incredible screw-ups in my career, but I was just really lucky that most of them happened when I wasn't held to account for them. Most of my generation, if we talk about the war fighters who became senior leaders in Iraq and Afghanistan, most of those people never got in any trouble. And you say, well, is that the best collection of war fighters? And I'm not sure that is,
Thank you.
I personally totally agree with this point. I think even in our, even society as a whole, I feel like, in the earlier generations, you would allow like kids, right? Maybe teenagers, or even like, kids who are like 10 years old, they can do a lot of things. They have lots of freedom. They basically can experiment, can feel. And nowadays, anyone that is like, not as old as 16, has to be under parents, watch like all the time. This is, I don't think it's as conducive.
Yeah.
So another question from the audience. Basically, what do you think of the information risk to competitors? In military environments, jumping to the other side is rare. But in business, for example, someday, like a person works for this company today, and then like a rising leader, and next day can work for another person, and then this person in this organization is actually fully aware, in this model of all the structure and all the insider information.
Yeah. It's a really serious issue. In the military, we worried about security, classified information. And we were obsessed with not sharing information. You all have seen movies where somebody goes, they're not going to tell because you don't have a need to know. The fallacy in that is who knows who needs to know. There was more than one occasion where we were about to launch and go get some bad guy. And the CIA called me and said, that person is our source. He works for us.
Oh, man.
And I said, well, good thing you called me now. 15 minutes from now, I'd have brought him to you in handcuffs or a body bag. Because there was this sense of, couldn't tell, but there's a real fallacy in that.
Yeah.
We also had a case where we did an operation in northern Iraq, and we captured Al-Qaeda in Iraq's personnel files for all the suicide bombers and foreign fighters they were bringing in for about a year period. It was amazing. So we captured this, and we got the information from my headquarters, and it said where they came from, what town, what country. So if we could give that information back to those countries, their authorities could go to families, and they could try to stop this. But it's this, classified information. And so I'm sitting there going, my God, we're going to have all this information, but, what can we really do with it? And my intelligence officer said, sir, you captured it, meaning we, my command. I said, okay, I got that. He goes, therefore, you're the classification authority. You decide what the classification is. I said, really? I could make it unclassified. He said, you could. And I said, I do. Because this is the Al-Qaeda's personnel files. They know what's in their personnel files. We're not going to give them something they didn't have. Also, they know we've got them because we raided the place. And so what's the threat from the enemy? So we released them and we put them out to a bunch of these allied countries we're working with great effect. Now, the CIA got very upset with me initially, and, you know, because I unclassified it. But the reality was we were obsessed with overclassifying. And then we learned, we did this big video teleconference every day with 7,500 people. It was top secret at classification level. Not all the information was, but most of it was temporal. Most of it, 48 hours later, didn't matter if the enemy knew it. And so we learned not to sweat it too much. You know, we were always worried about a Chelsea Manning come in and take information and leak it. But the reality is the danger of hoarding it and compartmenting it was worse than the danger of some of it getting out, as long as you're not doing illegal stuff and all. So I think that on our standpoint, we learned an awful lot. In civilian companies, the first client for the firm I started, McChrystal Group, was Scott's Miracle-Gro, lawn and garden company. Mm-hmm. And you go, well, you know, lawn and garden company people, how smart can they be? Well, my response to you would be, they sell dirt and you buy it. You tell me who's smart. So we're working with them for a while, and they made amazing changes. And the lawn and garden business is extraordinarily competitive. And it's competitive for these 2 short periods a year, primarily in the spring during everybody goes and works in your yard and garden for about an 8 or 10 week period. And so if you can get information on your competitors, screw them up, you really get a big leg up. Scott's got so fast that I remember at one point somebody raised the question that y'all just did. And the president's response was, we could take our strategy, we could take our information, and we could email it to our competitors today, and it wouldn't help them. They're not fast enough to compete with us now. And that's sort of the way I think. Things move fast enough and complex for the most part. It's like I mentioned at the beginning, the theory of team of teams is not hard. The execution of team of teams is hard. It is high energy, high focus, total commitment to do it, but it works.
Yeah. So basically, I guess it's safe to say that, you know, in an organization, you know, we should just move as fast as possible and focus on execution rather than, you know, worrying about, okay, you know, this guy might leave and then, you know, like do something else.
Exactly.
Yeah. I would say it sounds like either implicitly or explicitly you were doing some threat modeling too, thinking about this particular information, right? What can the enemy do with it? I think the amount of threat modeling is very different than the amount we do in Silicon Valley, but it would be sort of useful to know, I don't know, what % of energy you spend on that type of activity.
Yeah, we did spend energy on it. We had certain kinds of information that we were extraordinarily careful about. And you can imagine what they are. It was the identification of sources, who our sources are, spies, and things like that. Time and place of future operations, very, very important. But it ended up being a very small amount. And what we found is when you try to make everything totally classified and held tightly, you really can't, you're not protecting anything because you're trying to protect everything. We culled that down to a very small number of types of information, and we protected them really carefully. And we never really had any issues with it.
We've had a couple of questions about process, which I think also gets down to specifics of how you make things happen. Someone asked about the AAR and how that fits into continued team of teams model. Someone else has asked, how did you arrive at the model of daily updates, liaisons, and everything, and how much trial and error is required in sort of figuring out the right process?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part first, the after action review. The after action review is misunderstood by a lot of people, but it's pretty sacred. It is how to get better, how to learn from an operation. And what happened was in World War II, there would be firefights. And after the firefight, there'd be this account of what happened, a report of what happened. And that would go forward. And there might be lessons learned from it. And then they found out when they actually went and interviewed every soldier in the firefight, they found that nobody had an accurate picture of what happened. Everybody saw their part of the elephant and nobody understood the elephant. And so as a consequence, the lessons learned were completely wrong because they were so limited in perspective of whose perspective it was. So after action reviews correctly done, in my experience, first ferret out as much truth about it as you can. It's never complete, but it can be really good. And then from that truth, you start to get, I'm sounding like Ray Dalio now, you start to get an understanding of what you need to do differently. How do you really learn? And then you can get shared lessons, and that can be remarkably effective. So that was the key. What was the other part of the question? I'm sorry, repeat that.
It was how you arrive at a process, the daily liaison and everything, how much trial and error is required.
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, as I do this again, I do this with civilian companies now, much less. But we were entire trial and error. And the reason we were is there was no model for this in the military. And so there was a cultural aversion to it. I'd never done this before. I mean, there are some people who thought network theory. If we'd read a lot of that stuff and studied, we might have gone into this smarter, but we didn't. We wandered into it. We had this hairy problem we couldn't solve, and we started iterating our way to success. The first thing we did was start trying to break down the silos between the different organizations in my command. You know, we had this command that was made up of Delta Force, SEAL Team 6 and whatnot. And you say, well, they're all commandos. They got to be like brothers. No. Well, yeah, they were like brothers in my family. I had 4 brothers and a sister. And we fought like cats and dogs. They hated each other, these different organizations. And they hated each other theoretically because they were so different, but in reality because they were so alike. And so we had to break down those so that they would work together. And there were all these impediments. They swore they couldn't work together because the battlefield was different. No, it wasn't. They swore they couldn't work together because, they carried different, all the reasons were total BS. So we started putting exchange people between the organizations. We started creating cross-functional teams. We started doing forcing functions. And then this daily video teleconference put everybody in transparency. And what that did was, and we didn't intend this, it was designed to share information, but it started creating linkages and empathy across and trust across the force, because you're a Delta Force troop commander in Iraq and you're doing your op. But one morning you listen to a peer in Afghanistan, a SEAL commander, and he's describing his operation. He might be dirty, he might still have blood on him. And he goes, we did an operation last night, it was really hard. And suddenly you're going, wow, I'm having a lot of problem here. He's having a lot of problem there. And you start to build this sense, hey, we're all dealing with a lot of problems. And so a certain level of empathy would go. And then you'd hear him say, we just saw the enemy implement this new tactic or this new piece of technology. And you'd go, wow, I'm getting glimmers of that. You reach out to them. And so across the force, instead of things going in the silo vertically and across at the headquarters and then get trickled down, which is too slow, people started communicating across because they go, wow, I need to talk to you about that. That worked. Why did that work? And all these informal conversations would occur. And then we had something that we stumbled on, and it was management of key resources. And we called them high demand, low density resources. And that was helicopters, unmanned aerial drones, and interrogators. We were always short those, and that determined how many operations you could do and how effective they would be. And so we used to centrally manage those. And we centrally managed them, and we would decide who had the highest priority operations, and we would apportion them that way. And then for the next 24 hours, they would have that. And that was absolutely logical, and that's, good management, and we're doing it. But we found that you lock those assets up for the 24-hour period, and sometimes they get not used because intelligence doesn't mature, or underused. And so we changed it. We opened sort of a bazaar or a marketplace. We still apportioned out the assets to the highest priority intelligence, the organizations that had the best intelligence at that point. But then we opened it up so that if I had the helicopters from, for that night, somebody calls me and says, when are you going to use them? I said, well, I'm planning on striking it 9 o'clock at night. And they say, can I get them at midnight when you're done? And you go, yes, you can. And then somebody else calls and says, can I get them at 3 a.m. to strike a target when you're done, when they're done? Yes. And you say, well, why would they give them up? They give them up because tomorrow night they may not have priority, and they wanted to be able to go to somebody and say, can I use them? So what we found is we started getting about 3 and 4 times the usage out of these high demand assets, but we could never have managed that centrally and done it fast enough. They did it informally. We watched it. We called it eyes on, hands off. So we watched this marketplace occurring, but we didn't screw with it because we thought that any little tweak we would make would be less effective than letting priorities. And people got really good at giving assets up when somebody else's priority rose because intelligence matured, and they did because they knew that was best for the organization.
I think that's getting to a conversation about sort of agility versus efficiency, which you covered pretty early in the book and is, I think, always a tension actually. But, and I might want to come back to that, but I think I'd like to shift actually. We've gotten some audience questions about current events, and I think also there's enough going on that it's sort of hard not to address and think about a little bit. And this is something I talked about with my brother this morning. You were speaking about siblings. We happen to be in Little Rock right now with my mother. We're thinking about sort of historical context to military involvement in civilian affairs. There's a great visitor center here at Little Rock Central High where in the 50s, the governor wanted to use the military to prevent school integration. Eisenhower said, no, that group is going to escort the students in and create the start of this process in a peaceful manner. I think the other sort of historical point that comes up is Rodney King in LA, which was very different during the George W. Bush presidency. And so what I'm building to is sort of what can be the role of military in domestic affairs. And I think I would say as much or as little as you want.
Yeah. I'm going to sound a little contradictory here because I think the use of the military in Little Rock was appropriate. And the book I wrote after Team of Teams, part of it was on Martin Luther King Jr. And so I think that the deft use of federalizing National Guard and bringing in active forces was correct. But that was a pretty unique situation. And it was also fraught with danger because you bring in federal troops, it felt a lot like Reconstruction. Now, I think it was necessary and it was for a good cause. But I am very hesitant to use federal troops in anything that looks like law enforcement for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is they're not trained for it. We got riot control training when I was young because I started, in the early 70s, but we weren't competent at it. And once you get military forces into that kind of environment, you have all kinds of opportunity for mistakes to be made and whatnot. And from the military standpoint, you just would prefer not to be involved. I also think it's dangerous if people start viewing the United States military potentially as a tool of oppression. Because if people look at uniforms and they start to say, okay, that combat uniform is something that is repressing me. One person on one side of the street may think they're defending them, another person thinks they're repressing them. Then you start to change the relationship between the United States and its military. And there's countless examples around the world of places where militaries are there, and that's not a place that I would like our military to be. Now, again, I'm contradicting because I think during the COVID-19 thing, putting out engineers, putting out medical people is good. We're defending Americans. But when you are putting them in a place to do population control, then I think that it better be pretty dire. I remember 1992, and I remember the troops that went to Los Angeles, and I'm not saying that was wrong. I wasn't one of them who went there, but I would say you really have to have a situation where that's necessary before I think it's a good idea. I think, I think the bar should be very high to doing that.
A much more general note, as we talk about the leadership lessons from the book, is there anything that you would advise people to apply to the sort of uncertainty of all the context we're in now, or things we can apply on an individual level?
Yeah, if we think about the uncertainty right now, we've got really three things at once hitting. We've got COVID-19, which is this amorphous viral threat. It's nowhere, but it's everywhere. And it's terrifying to people because they don't really understand how at risk they are, what they should do or not do. Second, we've got an economic threat, which is very real. And although the people on this call probably aren't feeling it personally, you probably know people who are losing jobs. I mean, you don't have to know too many people to know people who are losing jobs, or at least terrified of that. And then third, there's the idea of civil unrest. And civil unrest I'm going to do broadly because it's not just civil unrest from this, it's this sense that society is at a sort of a low boil, and it has been for some time now. And so you put those things together, and suddenly, what do leaders need to do? What's the role of a leader? The first is you can't eliminate uncertainty, nor can you lie your way through it. You can't stand up in front of your team and say, there's no uncertainty, we're fine, and then be working with your board on personnel cuts. You can't say that I know how long COVID-19 is going to last, because you don't. You can't say the economic challenge will go away at this period, because you don't know that. So you're in front of your team saying, I don't know. And most of these variables, you as a leader can't do much about. In most cases, you can't control things which will force actions in your company or organization that will have to happen. So that's pretty thin gruel. So what do you get in front of your team and say? I don't know what's going on. I don't know what we're going to do about it. And I'm sort of helpless. Nobody wants to get in front of their team and say that. I think what you need to do is get in front of your team and basically be absolutely honest with them. You don't have to be frightening about it, but you can say, these are unknowns and uncertainties. They deserve the truth. Even inside your own organization, where decisions may have to be made, people may have to be let go, I think they deserve the truth there. Say, we are doing this, and these are the parameters we're using, and we'll do our best. And if you don't know exactly what's going to happen, don't tell them you do. Just say, we're figuring it out, and we will let you know. But leaders have got to be present. You can't say that and then retreat. You got to get in front of it, and you got to stand up in front of people, and you've got to be willing to lead. Sometimes that means just being, the inspirational leader. Sometimes that means putting yourself in a position where it's hard or dangerous or any of those things. What we can't do is have people think that leaders are sort of retreating while the hurricane's coming, and when the hurricane's coming, they're going to come back out with their, leader clothes on and say, okay, here we go. People are going to remember how leaders conduct themselves right now, and how they treat people, and how they connect to people, and how I'm not saying sympathize with people, rub their bellies, but I'm saying empathize with the fact that if you were 23 and you're living in a small apartment, your wife just lost her job, or your husband just lost his job, and you're working from home, and you got 3 kids who aren't in school because the school's closed, life's a little bit more challenging than it might be for others.
So, on this note, right, we're talking about organization and leadership. So usually, this leadership, for example, like in a lot of organizations, is actually, it's basically appointed. For example, like you get a CEO, right? So usually, appointed by the board. But, in the United States, in this case, for example, our president, is basically elected. And then this election cycle, and then the election process, it's not about demonstrating leadership in getting votes. And so what do you think of, like, in that sense, like how do you think that in the future, as like citizens, as people, how do we actually navigate, that uncertainty? And also, like, a related question from the audience is, so basically American operates on 2 relatively short cadence, election, every 4 years. And then, there's an earnings report every quarter. So this kind of results, short-term results driven, cadence, basically it makes people, it makes it really hard for us to make long-term decisions.
Yeah, it really does. And it makes it hard for people to be responsible for reaping what they sow.
Yeah.
And so, CEOs have a tendency to think more short range because they have to survive, but also it's in their interest to do that. Politicians think in very short terms. I remember when Mike Bloomberg one day said, no legislature will ever do long-term big infrastructure things. He was talking about a big flood control plan for New York. He said that will only get pushed by executive leadership because the incentives for the groups are different. It's hard for a legislature to think long-term. They're not rewarded for that kind of thing in the ballot box. I'm very worried about America's democracy right now on several levels. One is, as Stockdale said, you've got to have an educated electorate or you're not going to have a really valid democracy. And although we have an electorate that's bombarded with information right now, I don't think we have an electorate that is educated. And I'm not being elitist on this. I'm saying we're given so many things. It is very hard for someone really to sort out what's right and what they should think about. And some of these issues are pretty complicated. And so asking people to do that, I don't have a solution for it. I wish I did, but it worries me a lot because the effect of modern communications is not what I thought it would be. I thought it would be the Wikipedia effect. And over time, you get enough information,
Right.
Truth would come out.
Yeah.
That's so far, that's not been the fact. And so what we get is the ability to sway huge parts of the population. And it worries me for this election because I think, the Russians were involved last time, other players will be. And if somebody's pretty good at it, it wouldn't take too much to influence an election, just by the timing of putting out information and whatnot and getting people riled up. So that concerns me an awful lot. And I'm not sure what we do. I personally am a believer that voting should be mandatory. Every American should have to vote. And they could vote for nothing. They should have to go in. They could have the option to go in the booth and put, I vote for neither of these candidates, neither of these bums. But we would end voter suppression because you take that off the table. Everybody votes. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who would not support that because it wouldn't be in their interest.
Yeah, it's almost the kind of thing that you have to introduce gradually because a sudden change in the electorate would create such a change in party incentives that I kind of assumed both parties wouldn't want to have something so sudden they'd have to adapt to. Phil Gara asked what I think is a good question about sort of culture and strategy and getting to some of the things you said about understanding people's incentives and where people come from, which is that one thing that some of us are learning from Black Lives Matter is that people have sort of very different cultures, very different lived realities, and they, in many people's opinions, should bring sort of that whole self to work. But then how do you, this is broad, you can take it wherever you want, but how do we lead with uniting these diverse teams, and how do we lead for so many sort of different sorts of people at a time, with the understanding that diversity makes the organization stronger if you manage the organization well in other ways? Yeah.
This is easy to say, diversity is good. In the military, particularly in special operations, because you had these selection and assessment processes, you ended up selecting a pretty narrow range of individual because you were looking for certain things. So you got people who were very, very alike. And if you have a company, and I know there's been, of course, tech companies get beat up for not having diverse boards. And everybody says diverse boards are important, except my board. And what I want is the best people get the damn job done. And after we're successful, then I get diverse after that. So if you've got a company and you say, I want people to bring their whole selves to work, but it brings a certain amount of entropy with it. It's a tough balance. I think long-term, we sort of all know, we've learned in the military, we're much better diverse. We are just a better organization that way. But getting there is always just a little bit upsetting. It's easier to have Saddam Hussein's generals all looking at you and nodding than it is to have a bunch of people with different, from the back going, hey, what happened? So this is where short and long-term things, incentives, and horizons matter so much. If an organization's got long-term horizons, then the impact of diversity, in my view, is far more positive. It's more clear why you want to do that. If they're very short-term, it's much more clear why I just want the players who can get it done right now, and won't cause me any heartburn. But we're struggling to make that work. But it is getting better. I mean, it's, in my mind, it's getting far better. It's just not there yet.
Yeah, I think related, we've had some people wonder about specific leadership traits and personal traits, either traits you look for, or given what we just said about diversity, you probably don't look for the same trait all the time, but what suite of traits should we look for in creating teams that will be really effective?
Yeah, and I've evolved on this through my career. Now I would start with character. And you say, okay, what's character? That's a combination of things. I think at the bedrock, it's values. I tell people right now, character is more important to me than competence. It's more important to me than anything else, experience, because character, when everything else is said and done, is going to matter an awful lot. If you haven't had the chance to read it, James Stockdale, the Army or the Navy flyer who was shot down in Vietnam, wrote a paper about his 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton called The World of Epictetus. And of course, you know, Epictetus is the famous Stoic. And what he describes is, in a horrific environment where you lose all control over your physical surroundings, and, they can break you with torture whenever they want, because that's what happens. Character is all you have. It's what you hold on to. It's your values. And so I think that's number one. If I was going to step back from that, I'd say what I look first for is empathy in people. Now, I'm quick to say that isn't sympathy. I'm interested in somebody who can get on the other side of the table and see how somebody else might view an issue. You can disagree with them, you can hate, you can do anything, but if you can get out of your perspective enough to appreciate there's another side of this issue, and probably, it's valid. I know in Iraq, we're fighting against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and I used to describe to people, our best commandos in America's most elite units, you think they're at one end of the spectrum, and the most effective terrorists in Al-Qaeda in Iraq are at the other end. I said, no, it's not absolutely true. They were much more like this. Our best people were much more like their best people than different. Mm-hmm. It's just who recruited them early in life. What experiences took them to where they got. They were people who wanted to believe in a cause, who were absolutely committed, were physically courageous, all those things. And so the only difference was where they happened to grow up and what life experiences took them there. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important that when I think of empathy, I think of its ability to understand that and then try to get the best out of people who have a very different frame of reference.
So in that, on this regard, so, for us rising leaders, doesn't matter whether founders of startups or, like leaders at a company, big company, like how do you actually pick those people and implement a team of teams model that, that would actually basically make it more effective?
Yeah. Long answer to a great question. In Jsoc, when I was younger in it, I was in the command for many years before I became the commanding general. We had a caste system. The top of the caste were operators, Delta operators, SEAL Team 6, sort of barrel-chested freedom fighters, hard men. There were some women, but mostly men. And then you went down through pilots, and then operations people ran operations. And then you get down to intel people and logistics, and then, pretty low as support people, that sort of thing. And you could see this in our dining facilities. You could see this in our gyms. You could see this in just kind of people operating. When we got in the fight in Iraq, meritocracy started to come out, because what we found was many of those skills got commoditized. Somebody could kick open a door and shoot straight, and we actually had a lot of people who could do that. We had a lot of people who could fly helicopters. We had fewer people who could take all source intelligence and pull it together into a coherent picture. There are a lot of people who do peace intelligence, but we call them all source analysts, who could actually put a puzzle together. That was a much smaller group. Then there was an even smaller group who we could put in an embassy as our rep in an embassy, and they could deal with the head of the CIA, they could deal with the ambassador, they could deal with foreign intel services, they could do a team building effect in a complicated environment. And we found out that that was a small subset, and we could only find those because they were personality based by sort of trial and error. And some of them were our best operators, our best pilots, or whatever. And we pulled them out of there, and we put them doing what was a higher priority. And they didn't always like it, because you want to do that sort of macho thing you've been raised to do. But those were the truly critical tasks. That's how we started looking for leaders who could lead in this kind of environment. And we very carefully nurtured them and managed them, because they were a pretty small subset of the entire force. You could train people to do everything. You could make everybody better, but you could only make a small percentage able to really pull this stuff together in a higher order level.
Yeah, I think it's a common sort of question that you can't really train integrity or character, and can't even really recognize them until you've worked with someone for a while. So it's not obvious how you choose those people and nurture them.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's a great point. You can make it the ethos of the unit, so anybody who lies isn't respected. You can do those things, but under pressure, those people who those character and values are just bedrock, you don't train that. People have it, and they've sort of grown up with it, or they don't.
So in that case, you know, let's say if you are a founder of a startup, or, you know, you're managing a big company. So the only way to do this is actually, you know, going through tough situations, or, you know, when they be very observant. And then when there's a tough situation, and then observe, and then pick those people, and then that are actually, you know, would do the job.
I mean, I am the founder of a startup that's 10 years old now, and we've been through all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And that's right. But the thing to remember is the biggest thing you do is the development of your people. You know, people say it's selection of your people. Yeah, but that's really, really hard.
Yeah.
You know, it's more developing as they come and culling out people who don't turn good. But it's hard to do that, because when times are easy, there's not a great incentive to cull the herd and push people forward. And when times are tough, you're so worried about the alligators, you don't think about draining the swamp. But so it's building that into almost the DNA of the organization that I think is so key.
Yeah, actually, you know, we're talking about, actually, there's lots of questions actually in the audience actually relates to culture. So you know, when you see the DNA of the team, it is, you know, it's the culture that we talk about, you know, in a business organization. So you know, from my personal experience, you know, working with different type of companies and startups, it feels like in the very beginning, that few key people that you hire, that you assemble around you, and has to have a like mind, in the sense that have to form this key culture. And then, you know, as the organization grows, you know, it gets harder and harder. So yeah, so, you know, back to the points, you know, like how do you actually make sure that when the team grows bigger, and how do you maintain that DNA and make sure that that DNA actually gets, you know, kind of gets propagated, that culture gets propagated.
Yeah, if you ever figure that out, you're going to be a skillionaire. I was with Mark Benioff one day, and we were in this big dinner, and probably 400 or 500 of his team, and this is 6-7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, Mark, what's your biggest problem? He says, let me show you. And he grabbed the mic, he stood up, he says, everyone who's been in this company for less than 6 months, stand up. And it was about 70%. He says, that's my problem. And, you know, so that's a good problem to have. But when you get that growth, even if the founders develop this wonderful culture, when you start to get rapid growth, suddenly it's hard to remember most of the people weren't there when that happened. And so everything that gets further from the founding, you know, you've got to either recreate it or you've got to, you're never going to hire for it because you just can't do that effectively. So I think it's got to be very intentional. I think organizations have got to decide what their culture is. They've got to try to put it in training systems. They got to push it. And then they got to understand it's always going to be hard. Look at the big companies that are very successful. Google struggled with that. Facebook has got an internal revolution going on right now. Those things are going to happen. So it's just got to be constant.
So basically, in that sense, you know, the culture is also constantly evolving.
Yeah.
I have a question about complexity and mitigating the threat of complexity. I think maybe from that it's obvious that there is so much complexity in the world, and how do you deal with that threat? And actually, I'll throw in another question too, which is how do you assess your readiness for big problems like pandemic, which I feel it's not directly complexity, but on a systems level, it's probably related thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask this because I'm in the midst of writing a book right now on risk. And the analogy that I'm using is you have a human immune system, and your human immune system is designed to detect threats, and you get thousands of them every day to your health. Assess that threat, decide what it should do about it, respond to that threat, and then learn. And goes to the lymph nodes. So the next time you get that threat, you've got immunity, and boom, your body responds very, very quickly. We don't even notice it because our immune systems just crank day after day after day, and so the vast majority don't affect us. When HIV wakens the immune system, you don't die from HIV. You die from some stupid little thing to which you've lost the natural defenses. So I think organizations and individuals need to have a risk immune system that is almost the same way. It detects risks as they come, has an ability to assess them very rapidly, do an appropriate response, and learn from it. Now, all that said, easy to say, but that means that inside the organization, you've got to communicate really well. You've got to have diverse perspectives so you can see things different way. You've got to understand you have natural biases and that what you see is going to be biased, and you got to account for that. You're going to have to get over the temptation to not take action, because most organizations have this aversion to action. You're going to have to get the timing right. How fast do you respond? Look at the United States response to COVID-19. We just literally swung late at the pitch for lots of reasons, and it cost thousands of lives. And so you get this organizational risk immune system that's got to be really healthy, all the different parts of it communicating and operating to be able to respond appropriately in a timely fashion and learn from it. And I think that takes practice. I think you've got to look at your organization. You've got to think about it, because I'm on a task force for the Council on Foreign Relations right now to prepare for the next pandemic. But we did figure out very quickly, just get more ventilators and more PPE, that's not it. You know, you can't prepare for the last, or you can prepare for the last pandemic, but the one thing we're sure won't come again is the last thing. Something new is going to come, some different kind of challenge. May not be a pandemic, maybe, you know, completely different kind of challenge. And that's what you're trying to prepare the organization for. And that's the thing about complexity. If we knew the threat that was coming, we would build the Maginot Line and defend France. But the threat evolves because you've got the Maginot Line, and therefore you really have got to have a system that is by definition adaptable.
Yeah, if you have solutions to that, I'm very excited to read them in the next book, because it does seem like 2006 we started preparing for pandemic, but it's, you know, that wasn't that many years ago, but it's hard to stay prepared for even a decade and a half. And probably right after each time there's been an attack on an airplane, that particular type of attack is prevented in the future. But it does seem much, much harder for an organization as large as the US government or the United States to prepare for the next thing. So looking forward to the solutions.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's so easy to prepare for the last thing.
On a lighter note, Dimitri Turbiner would like to hear interesting war stories. If you got anything particularly insightful or, in his words, particularly wild to share, would love it.
Yeah, there's a pretty funny things happen in war that are funny. I mean, you can't help it. You say, well, war is serious and business is serious and life's serious, but there's stuff that's pretty darn funny too. We did an operation one time and we had Navy SEALs in this remote part of Afghanistan, and they went to this compound, and most compounds are built for privacy and security in rural Afghanistan. They got big walls around them, often towers at the corners that look like little Foreign Legion forts. And so the bad guys were in there, we knew that. And so we landed helicopters a good distance away so they couldn't hear. We walked in. And we got there, we had SEALs come, and they climbed the walls in 3 sides and got up over the walls and got on the parapet on the inside. And they're prepared to control the inside of the compound. And then we had a group blow open the front gate. And when the group blew open the front gate, of course, the enemy got riled awake and whatnot. And on one side of the wall, one of our SEALs is standing on top of this parapet, but it's really the roof of a building, a barracks underneath it. And so he's on there, he's feeling good about life. And from the door below, which he can't see, a Taliban guy comes out with a rocket propelled grenade and shoots it at SEALs across the compound. No, he doesn't hit them, fortunately, but he shoots this rocket propelled grenade from the doorway. Now, if you know how rocket propelled grenades work, they have a backblast to them. So this big black blast blows back into the room where the guy's standing in the doorway, actually caves in the room because of the pressure. So now the SEAL lands and he's in the midst of 7 Taliban. They're surprised, he's surprised. And after the operation, he comes out of this thing, and I remember asking him, I said, wow, kind of, what about that? He goes, yeah, surprised the hell out of me. Landed in amidst these guys, worked his way through the problem, came back out the other side and says, lesson learned, I will never stand on the parapet again.
Crazy. How about highlights from the Joint Chiefs time? That must also have been interesting. Must have been a lot going on.
That's an interesting dynamic because the Joint Chiefs of Staff, founded after the Second World War, really, I mean, they existed in the Second World War, but really got formalized after 1947. They are the leaders of all the different services, military service, Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Chief of Naval Operation Commandant of the Marine Corps, whatnot. And they are designed for 2 purposes. They are designed to represent their services in the joint world, but also to act as a separate body to advise the chairman and then the Secretary of Defense and Vice President. And of course, we've all read stories about this, during the Bay of Pigs or during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff were very bellicose and, like Curtis LeMay was the big Air Force Chief of Staff, and he's, giving the bomb them back in the Stone Age thing. But what I found was I came in, I was the director, I was the Chief of Staff. So I was a 3-star, they were 4 stars, but I was the person orchestrating this thing. I found the dynamic very, very interesting. I found a great reticence on the part of the Joint Chiefs to do their job. And I'm not saying that they were lazy or anything like that. I'm saying they had come to the conclusion that their relationship with the civilian leadership was one of mechanics to car owners, and that their mission was to wait and be told what to do and then execute that. Partly that's true, but the other part is to advise what we ought to do. And, you sometimes, before you have the mechanic replace the engine in your car, you ask them, do I really need a new engine? Is this a good idea? Is this car still worth putting money into? And I found that role had deteriorated. And it had deteriorated for lots of reasons. You had a very strong Secretary of Defense a few years before in Donald Rumsfeld, and he sort of run roughshod over everybody. And then the chiefs had gotten more comfortable getting narrow and into their lane. And so as a consequence, what we lost was sort of the balance. And that balance is sacred. The civil-military interaction in our country is effective when you have effective interaction. When you have just directions down and information up, it's not effective. Now, it takes work. It's always balance. I mean, you shouldn't have it too strong either way. But if you don't, you're not going to get the right kind of outcome.
I should pause there and see if Lee or Rachel has any sort of broad closing type questions.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Rachel.
Go ahead, Lee. So I have a question about levels of leadership. And throughout your decades of career, you have had the great fortune of first commanding tens, then hundreds, then thousands and tens of thousands, if not more. And at each level, you see the impact at different levels. That at the smaller level, you see the impact on the individuals and as they grow. And at larger commands, you lose some of that of being able to see the individual impacts, but then you start seeing the impacts of your decisions on the front page of the newspaper instead of the individual level. And I would love to know what you found personally most fulfilling throughout those levels.
Yeah. When you're at the lower levels, what's most fulfilling is being around people that you privates and sergeants you admire. You really feel this sense of, you desperately want their acceptance. You want their respect and acceptance. You don't want to be their buddy, but you want them to respect you as a fellow warrior. And once you get that point, then you really love that. When you get very senior, the advantage is you can scratch certain issues you wanted to when you were junior. Certain things that you think need to be done a certain way, you have the power to do them. You can push down in the organization. You can do things. You can develop people. But you're right. You start getting pulled more and more up toward the political side of it. And you start making decisions that affect many thousands of people, and they have huge import. And I remember I went through the really arduous set of decision-making with President Obama to decide to send more troops to Afghanistan. And that was a tough decision. Tough decision for him, tough decision for the country, tough recommendation for me to make. And we went through that, and I thought did a good job on that. But as soon as he approved the troops, I remember going, what have I just done? I now got 30,000 more Americans and 10,000 more Europeans coming to a place where some of them are going to get killed. And was that right? Was my recommendation responsible? Now, I think that it was, but it wasn't a slam dunk. I mean, there was plenty of room to say, no, shouldn't have, should have said that, can't be done, that sort of thing. And of course, everybody has an opinion on Afghanistan. But it starts to get really tough then, because most military leaders remember the personal part. That's the visceral part. We're not as comfortable in the political part, most. And so it's like you're tugged in two directions. And you've got to make big decisions. There's a great quote from a book, The Killer Angels, in which they have the character Robert E. Lee say, to be a great soldier, you must love the army. But to be a great commander, you must be willing to order the destruction of the thing you love. And that is the tension that you feel. And I think it's healthy. I mean, I wouldn't want you not to feel the tension, but it never goes away.
Thank you.
I guess that also applies to organization, to be during COVID, for example, a lot of companies actually had attritions. I mean, I'm sure that, like they wouldn't want to let their colleagues, go, but for the health organization, they have to. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. You say the organization exists largely to take care of the people who are in it. And then you turn around and fire people who are in it to keep the organization alive. And the only way to rationalize it is if the organization dies, you're not taking care of anybody.
Yeah. Exactly.
We're definitely at closing time now. I wondered if you want to share one more highlight, either from anything, but maybe from the startup experience that you've had over the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's doing a startup has been fantastic because I learned what's important to me. And what's important to me is creating a team I like being a part of. It's interesting because I'm at a different point in my life. I'm not trying to make a whole ton of money or anything like that. What I'm trying to do is recreate the kind of dynamic that I had at times in my military career where I like working with the people that I'm there with. And we've been able to do that. Now, we've had all the business challenges of the adventure of every startup. But it's a journey I'm glad I didn't miss because I was a little two-dimensional coming out of the military. And I don't claim to be fully three-dimensional now, but I would say I have a new appreciation, particularly for small business.
Well, the comments coming in now are just thank you. So I would join that.
Oh.
General McChrystal, Stan, thank you so much for joining, sharing your insights. We've really, really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and I wish everybody the best.
Excellent.
Thank
Thanks,
you. That's a round of applause. Great. Thank you everyone for joining. Look forward to the next book club. Stay tuned. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.